As promised, I'm going to share with you not only my recipe for fry bread, and I have two, a gluten-free and a regular. I'm going to share with you how to make those because believe it or not, whenever you have a recipe, it actually matters how you put that recipe together, the order that you put things together, how much you mix it, all of that matters. So I'm going to share with you how I make fry bread. Now, everyone has their own recipe. Everyone has their own method. There is no one right recipe. That's not a thing. So I'm sharing with you how I make fry bread, and I'm inviting you to change, alter, fix up, add, subtract, whatever it is that you need. And so this is a starting point for you. So the first thing I have is flour. I have this big bowl of flour. I've measured 3 cups of regular wheat flour. In this case, it's white flour, so it's the unbleached white flour, not whole wheat. Is it possible to make whole wheat fry bread? Yes, it is. If I was to make it, I would adjust the amount of baking powder by a little bit just to add a little bit more so that it gives it the rise you need. I have my baking powder here. I have 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and you might require more or less depending on your flour. So the more coarse your flour is, the more leavening agent you actually require to make the fry bread turn out. So for the flour I'm using and for the recipe that I have, I'm using 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. After you give the recipe a try once, you can adjust this if you have to. If you want like super crazy fluffy fry bread, although this will puff up a bunch, if you want it even fluffier, you could add just a little bit more. A little goes a long way. And then I have my salt. You can adjust the amount of salt for sure in this recipe. So I have 1 teaspoon. And this is enough for me. On the recipe, it says 1.5. You can add a 1.5. You can add 1 teaspoon. You can add half a teaspoon. On this recipe specifically, the amount of salt isn't going to be as critical. It's for flavor. So adjust it to your taste, but you can start with 1 teaspoon. And then, now a lot of people wouldn't add this, but I do because I use it, is milk powder. So I make my fry bread with water. And milk powder, what it does is it's adding a bit of fat without adding oil to your fry bread. One of the big differences between bannock and fry bread is we don't add fat to fry bread. We add fat to bannock that's going to be baked. And the reason is the fat makes it heavier and it doesn't fluff up the same way. Now, some people are going to say, well, I add fat to my bannock, or to my fry bread, and that's fine. This fry bread does not call for any fat to be added to it. But the milk powder adds a lot of flavor, an incredible amount of flavor actually. So I'm using 3 tablespoons of milk powder to 1.5 cups of water, which is what I'm going to mix into this. Now, you could just use milk if you'd prefer. You don't have to use any milk powder if you'd prefer. That part is also customizable. The parts that are pretty standard is the flour, the amount of water, and baking powder. Although I mentioned if your flour is a little bit different, you could adjust the baking powder a little bit. So I'm going to add this in here. I'm going to add this in here. Now I am going to, so I just dumped it all in. I am going to mix this just with a spoon. You don't need to use a big wooden spoon. I don't. It's going to be a rather easy to mix dough. So a little metal spoon is fine. And now I'm going to add my water. So I have 1.5 cups of water for every 3 cups of flour. Now that might change a little bit. Baking is more of a science, and one of the things that affects baking is the relative humidity where you live. If you live on the coast by the ocean, you're probably not going to need as much water in your fry bread mix because the flour is already more hydrated. So it doesn't need to absorb as much water. So I've added those things together and I have mixed in the water, and you can see I've just mixed a few times. I don't actually like to over mix my fry bread. I don't want to work the gluten in the flour. The gluten makes it stay together really tight and rigid. It makes it a bit chewier. And when you're baking bread with yeast, you want that. I don't need my fry bread almost at all. I'm going to combine it and then flatten it, as you're going to see. So I have combined this into what I call a shaggy dough. So it's not a perfectly smooth dough, like you can see the creases a little bit. That's what we want. And I can show you, like, it's a really relatively soft dough. So now I'm going to put some flour down on my counter. So I need to go and grab some more flour here. And I'm going to turn out my dough. So it just means dump it out of the bowl. And I'm trying, as I pick up my dough, I just want to try and get any of that flour and little bits of dough that are sticking. So I'm not kneading this. I'm just trying to stick the flour to it from the bottom of the bowl. So now it's all come out as one dough, and I'm going to put it on my flour there, and I'm going to press this out. I'm going to flip this as I'm pressing it so that I get flour on both sides of my dough so that it doesn't stick to my hands or the counter. Now I'm going to press this until it's about a 1/2 inch thick. So that's about right. Now I'm just going to clean my hands off and then we will continue. Okay, so one of the steps on making this recipe is to let the dough rest. This is actually important. So the flour has to absorb the moisture that we've just added to it. So if we go and we just put it into hot oil right now, we cut it up and fry it right away, it's not going to have had chance to absorb that water. Letting it sit while you heat up your oil, while you wash your hands, you can soak the dishes that you've used. It's important. So I am needing to let this sit for a few more minutes. About 10 minutes is about right. And then I'm going to cut up my fry bread into my squares or rectangles and put my slits into them. The slits are important. So if you just make a square piece of fry bread, it's going to puff up and be like that shaped, which is fine. However, sometimes what happens if you don't put the slit in it is that it does not cook evenly. And so you'll have dark brown on the outside, raw on the inside fry bread, which of course is disgusting. So I am going to make sure to put my slits down the middle and I'll show you what that looks like. And I'm starting to heat up my oil over here on the stove. So I've just got canola oil. That's what I have right now. And so what else could you use? You could use lard, you could use tallow. Tallow makes a nice crunch to your fry bread. Use what you have for fat. Olive oil doesn't taste the best when you fry bread in it. Avocado oil is okay. Canola oil is good. If you want to use butter, good on ya. That's expensive. So all of those regular cooking oils, vegetable oil is fine for making your fry bread. So I'm going to let this sit for a few more minutes and I'm going to come right back. All right, I'm ready to cut my fry bread. So I'm going to be doing rectangles or squares. Now you might ask, does it have to be a rectangle or square? Can I use a cookie cutter? Absolutely, you can. The slits in the middle are the more important part, but I do it this way because that's what I was taught. And we don't really want to waste any of it. But some of them are not going to be perfectly square because my dough that I've pressed out isn't perfectly square. Now, how big should your pieces be? Well, that's variable. You know, if you're making fry bread for a ceremony and you're going to have lots and lots of people, you could make them smaller. If you want to make them a normal size, like 3 inches by 3 inches is approximately right. So I'm going to cut some of these and just show you the size that I like to do them at. Okay, so there's a normal average piece of fry bread. Now I'm going to put my slits in the middle. I'm just going to put 2. Some people do 1, some people do 2, some people do 3. All of those are fine. We just want to make sure that it cooks evenly. So it might seem like a little bit of ridiculous work or that it's for aesthetics. It also makes it not puff into a ball because, you know, if you're making Indian tacos, which is what I'm making for dinner tonight, you can't put your Indian taco on a ball. You could cut it in half, I suppose, and then put both sides down. But this will be a little bit flatter. So now this first one that I'm going to put in, I'm just going to cut a little corner off of one of these odd shaped ones. And I'm going to put it into the oil to make sure it is ready. As soon as I dropped it in, and I'm going to show you this in just a second, as soon as I dropped it in, bubbles started coming up right away. Now it wasn't a violent eruption of bubbles, but they started immediately. They didn't sit in the oil in like one bubble. It started sizzling right away. That's the temperature that you need for your oil. You need it to start cooking the bread immediately. If the oil starts to soak into the dough, it's not going to fluff up properly. So this started sizzling immediately. I'm ready to cut all the rest of my fry bread and put it into the oil. So I won't make you watch me cut it all, but I'm going to bring you a little bit closer so you can see what it looks like when we're frying it. All right, I'm ready to put my fry bread in. I've cut them. I've got my slits in them. Let's see if you can see. So I've got my slits in the fry bread. A trick to getting those slits to go in nicely is to have a really well floured surface that you're working with on the top and the bottom of the fry bread. And then if you don't have it well floured, you're going to cut the slits and it's going to heal back up. It's going to seal again. So floured surface makes all the difference in the world with that. You can see I'm just dropping a bunch of these into my hot oil and it's sizzling immediately. Very important that it sizzles immediately. So I'm just going to give these a couple of minutes on each side, and this is the first batch. So this batch determines how much heat I need to have for my oil. So I might need to turn it up or turn it down depending on how long it takes. I just turned it down a bit because the fry breads are cooking very quickly. That's fine. I'm going to flip them halfway through. So that is about a minute that I've had them in there now. And I can always flip them another time if I need to brown them just a little bit more. So I'm going to let these cook for another minute on this side. I'm going to decide whether I want to flip them again. Then I'm going to pull them out and I'm going to put them onto paper towel. So I'm going to grab my paper towel right now. Okay, so I've got another minute on the other side, and I'm just going to flip them for another 20-30 seconds on the original side just to get them all nice and even for their color. And then I'm going to show you what they look like. Now, when I make fry bread for a large event, I put the fry bread in an order in the pan that I'm going to remember, and I have a pretty big cast iron pan that I use. And that allows you to not have some that end up burnt while others are still lighter, based on the order that you put them in and take them out in. It can take a little while to get them all in, to get them all flipped, to get them all out. And in that time, if you're not going in the same order that you dropped them in, the first one might be burnt by the time you get back to it. So I like to keep track of the order that I do that in. So here is my beautiful puffed up, you can see it's puffed up substantially, fry bread. So I'm going to get these out. So that one's puffed up really nicely too. And I'm going to now put my next batch in. I turned down the oil, so the next batch will take just a little bit longer. And I'm just watching the color of my fry bread. Because I have those slits in there, it's not likely going to be the case that I'll have raw on the inside and cooked on the outside. So I'm not too worried about that, but if you don't put those slits in, there is a very good chance of that happening. That's about all I can fit in the pan at once. So they start sizzling right away. They float to the top almost right away, and that's fine. So one thing that I could do as I'm pulling these fry breads out of the oil is I could dip them in some icing sugar or sugar and cinnamon. And so I'm going to do that with some of the odd smaller pieces. I'm going to make them into a sugary treat. That's one of my favorite ways to have fry bread. And so I'm going to flip these now. They're not quite at a minute, but I'm going to flip them a second time after. There we go. The other thing that I love for having with fry bread is jam. Strawberry jam's my favorite with fry bread. And especially for the gluten-free recipe that I'm going to share. I'm not going to make the gluten-free recipe tonight. I don't need to eat that much fry bread in a day, although I love to. So I'm going to make those tomorrow, and we make that with some corn flour and some other gluten-free flours. And that corn flour tastes amazing with strawberry jam. So, but you can have this with stew. You can make Indian tacos, which is what I'm going to have for dinner. There's all kinds of creations that you can make with fry bread, and I'm really excited as you practice your recipe. You don't have to use my recipe to participate in our Fry Bread Throwdown. So what's a throwdown? It's like issuing a challenge. It's like when the gloves come off, you throw them down onto center ice, and it's time to duke it out. So that's kind of what it means. So we're just throwing off the gloves and going to make our most amazing fry bread creations using this recipe or any other fry bread recipe that you have. Okay, so because I turned down the temperature, 2 minutes up per side is what I'm needing to get this cooked, and it's a nice golden brown. And that's what I have in the recipe. It's usually about 2 minutes per side. So I had turned my oil down to 6.5 on a stove that goes from 1 to 9 for the scale. So that's high medium heat for the oil, and it's taking about 2 minutes per side now, and I'm getting this golden brown color. So that's just perfect. And I'm going to take this out and put my last batch in, and then I put some in the icing sugar, and I'm going to bust it open and show you what it looks like inside the fry bread. I wish we had, the Willy Wonka smell-o-vision so that you could smell and maybe taste this recipe so that you know the texture, what it's supposed to be like. But alas, you're going to have to just do with sight. So I'm going to get this last batch going in here, and then I'm going to break one of those pieces from the first batch open that I put in sugar, and it should be cooled down enough that I won't burn myself. Okay, so, oh, it's so fluffy. Okay, so here I've put it in icing sugar, and I'm gonna bust it open. You can see it's so fluffy and light on the inside. I'm going to turn off the light that I have here, and maybe that'll help you see this. So you can see it's just gorgeous on the inside. It is so spongy and fluffy and light. That's what you want in your fry bread. And oh gosh, it's perfect. All right, so I have my last batch of fry bread going. I'm going to make my Indian tacos for dinner now. Thank you for sharing a few minutes with me as I share how I make fry bread. I hope you have a fantastic time with this recipe. I followed the recipe as it is written on the card, except for a little bit less salt, and that's just for taste. It's not overly salty. I could have all of the salt in there and it wouldn't taste too salty for my taste. However, I like it with 1 teaspoon, and when it comes to salt, if we don't have to add too much extra, then maybe we shouldn't. So that's the only alteration from the recipe that I've shared that I've made. It's just a little bit less salt. So I hope your fry bread creations turn out fantastic. And I'm going to share the gluten-free fry bread tutorial tomorrow. And I will share instructions. If you want to participate in our throwdown, I will officially issue the challenge to you to share your best fry bread creations. I'll share how to submit those, and I will be doing that on Friday. So until then, happy fry bread making and have a good night.